OPB Podcasts.
From the Gert Boyle studio, it's OPB Politics Now for Thursday, November 13th. The Trump administration's immigration crackdown is entering a new chapter in Oregon. A judge has permanently blocked the president from sending the National Guard to protect the ICE building in Portland. But the legal fight may not be over. And now the federal government may be looking to the Oregon coast to run a new immigration facility. We're here to give you the latest. Welcome to the podcast. I'm OPB Politics reporter Bryce Dole.
I'm OPB Politics reporter Dirk Vanderhart.
I'm OPB's Public Safety and Health Editor, Michelle Wiley.
Dirk and Michelle, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Hey, Bryce.
Dirk, you reported this week on the possibility of an ICE facility on Oregon's coast. Just tell us a little bit about when you started hearing that the federal government was looking towards Newport as a potential for its newest facility.
Yeah, this really got on my radar Monday morning. A tip came in that there was this growing concern ICE might be trying to set up maybe even a new detention facility on the coast, specifically in Newport, as you said, at the Newport airport, which is, a really tiny airport on the coast. I think it has 3 employees. But what became clear as we called around was that no one really knew anything concrete, right? There were some clues, something out of the ordinary was happening down there, little clarity on what it was. We talked to local, state, federal officials on Monday who were all really scrambling to get a handle on this situation. And all of them said ICE and the Department of Homeland Security that oversees ICE had basically stonewalled them. They weren't offering any details. Even so, though, the city of Newport felt like it had enough to put out a release on Monday evening, basically saying officials there had become aware ICE is hoping to create a new facility on the Oregon coast, that Newport and specifically the airport was being considered. So that obviously got a lot of attention.
And how did these officials start hearing about this? I mean, how did this come up?
Yeah, I think a couple things happened that really got people on high alert in Newport. The big thing was that the city got this sort of vague letter on November 4th. This was from a Texas company that's called Team Housing Solutions that's primarily known for really quickly setting up housing for troops and some other federal employees. And what the letter said was that Team Housing Solutions was interested in leasing a 4.3 acre patch of land at the airport. It wanted to build a fence around that land. It wanted to set up some buildings, some generators, and that would all be in the service of some federal agency, the name of which went unmentioned in this letter. The letter said the land would be needed beginning around December 1st. The other big and maybe more concerning thing for Newport, at least, was another change at the airport. So for decades, the Newport airport has had this Coast Guard airbase where a rescue helicopter is stationed. That's something the city has fought for repeatedly in the past because it is, the home to a large commercial fishing fleet. It has a lot of tourists in the water. The city wants this rescue helicopter nearby. But in late October, it turns out, with no warning, the Coast Guard relocated the helicopter. It moved it down the coast 100 miles to North Bend, effectively leaving this Newport air base vacant. And so the question was, what does the government want to use this base for instead?
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like there were all these different signs that brought up the concern that officials have voiced this week. But there's been other evidence that's emerged in recent days, right? That something might be coming. What is that?
Yeah, so since Monday, we've just seen more and more mounting evidence, really, that makes it look like ICE is, or at least was, serious about setting up a detention center in Newport. The biggest was that we saw a couple of government contractors with online job postings in Newport. One of those was literally for ICE detention officers. So pretty big clue there. But there were also want-ads for transport officers and medical personnel that might be needed for a detention facility. And then there was this other interesting inquiry that appears to have gone out to a local Newport septic company. This was from a federal contractor who was trying to get a sense of how much it might cost for services to haul between 5,000 gallons and 10,000 gallons of wastewater every day from the Newport airport. Definitely a signal, I think, someone was considering a big operation there.
And what has been the response to this news so far?
I mean, the reaction I've heard so far has been almost universal concern. You know, elected officials have been all opposed to it that we've talked to. That's state lawmakers, members of Congress, local officials in Newport, all been opposed to the idea of a detention facility at the airport. Actually, 4 members of the congressional delegation earlier this week demanded answers from Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem. Governor Kotek released a statement registering her displeasure with this. There was also, though, I think the best idea we got was this big public hearing last night at Newport City Hall, and Michelle was paying really close attention to that.
Yeah, so last night there was a special city council meeting, and there was this was really the only subject, and there was 2 hours of testimony.
Wow.
Where people really voiced concerns about the ICE facility, certainly, but also we heard a lot of concerns about the helicopter moving. People said that it's right ahead of like the weather turning, and it just creates a lot of fear about what the impact might be on people who are on the water. Here's Democratic State Representative David Gomberg, who spoke at the meeting last night.
We know that the Coast Guard rescue operation has left Newport, and we don't know if and when it may be coming back. This couldn't have happened at a worse time. With the weather changing, with the crabbing season beginning, we've fought this battle before, and we know that extended response times means that help may not arrive as soon as it's needed, and that lives may well be lost.
So that was definitely a present argument. We also heard from a lot of people who said, they don't want to see a detention facility in their community. They were concerned about not only the fears that would create among immigrants who live there. They were concerned about tourism, that people would stop visiting Newport. And I think, it was 2 hours of testimony. Not a single person testified in favor of the detention facility.
Wow.
And the city council member said, we're going to fight this. We do not want this in our community.
Mm-hmm.
And just to note really quickly, like there's a long history of push and pull over this Coast Guard helicopter that has been moved. You can hear sort of the passion in Gomberg's voice. I mean, this thing was stationed at Newport beginning in the 80s. In 2014, there was a move by Congress to pull it back. I think it was a funding issue. And the city forcefully reacted. I think there was a lawsuit. There was an injunction. I mean, people truly, truly value this resource there. And so I think that's part of a big part of some of the reaction Michelle saw last night.
And what have you guys heard from the federal government about why the Trump administration is doing this or wants to do this potentially?
Yeah, I mean, look, there is still a lot we don't know about the motive here. Very notably, I will say, ICE got back to me, to an inquiry I sent earlier this week, and it didn't deny it was planning a facility in Newport. It also didn't confirm it. It basically said, this administration is working at what it called turbo speed to stand up detention centers to carry out President Trump's deportation agenda. And it referenced these new immigrant detention centers that have been built around the country that have gotten these alliterative nicknames like Alligator Alcatraz in Florida's Everglades or one called the Cornhusker Clink in Nebraska, right? The suggestion seemed to be that something similar might be coming to the Oregon coast. And we should note, Oregon doesn't have an ICE detention facility at present. We are one of a few states that doesn't. But today, I mean, this morning, as we record this, I think the question is whether the federal government might be backing off of these plans. Again, we don't know, but we learned last night at this city council hearing that federal housing contractor that was inquiring about leasing land had pulled back that request. It is no longer looking to do that. And it also looks this morning like some of the job postings have been removed, like the ones for ICE detention guards or ICE transport officers. Those are no longer on the internet. It's just not clear why that is at this point. Again, so much left sort of vague and unclear in this situation.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to wonder if that might be a result of some of the public pushback that's occurred over the last week.
Yeah.
Right. We just don't know. I mean, we just don't know. We have inquiries to a host of government agencies and others about what might be happening. So we will keep you posted.
Okay, Michelle, let's turn back to you to talk about a different federal facility here in Oregon. There has been so much news, a fire hose of news unfolding around the court fight over President Trump's attempts to deploy the National Guard here. Can you just remind us a little bit about how we got here?
Yeah, I'll do my best. So, it's only really been a few weeks this has been going on, and it's been like action-packed with court news.
It feels like a year.
Let me take you back to the end of September. So folks probably remember that at the end of September, President Trump posted on Truth Social that he was planning to, send forces into Portland, called it war ravage, said that that was his plan. The very next day, we got word that the state had been told that members of the Oregon National Guard were being deployed over the objections of Governor Tina Kotek, who said, we don't need this. Local police has this under control. They filed a lawsuit to block the deployment of the Guard. And then for several weeks after, we had this kind of back and forth in court. So a few days after the announcement went out, a federal judge, Karen Immergut, issued a temporary restraining order saying you cannot deploy the Oregon National Guard. Then the federal government tried to deploy the California National Guard, which were already federalized, meaning they were already under the president's control. Karen Immergut issued a second restraining order saying you also cannot deploy the California Guard. You can't send the Texas Guard, which was something that they had said they were looking into. You can't send the Guard from anywhere into Portland for this purpose. Then that temporary restraining order, the first one about the Oregon Guard, went to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. The Court of Appeals makes a decision, says they can send in the Guard. Then they decide they're going to have a larger pool of appeals court judges. Sorry, this is so many judges. The appeals court decides they're going to rehear the case. They want to pull this thing called an en banc panel, where a larger group of judges would rehear the case and see if because they usually do that for tricky legal questions, of which this is one. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, Judge Immergut holds a 3-day trial over the lawsuit. So all of this temporary restraining order stuff, that was about whether the Guard can come or not. This is was it even legal to send them in the first place? Mm-hmm. And so after that 3-day trial, Immergut issues her decision. This was last week on Friday, and she issued a permanent injunction basically saying that, for these circumstances, you cannot send the Oregon Guard. The federalization was not lawful.
Mm-hmm. And we should note also, it's notable that Judge Immergut was appointed by the president as well. What was her reasoning for this order? What did she talk about in her final ruling?
Yeah, it was a very long ruling. It was, I think, 106 pages. Might be more, might be less. I can't totally remember. But she, and it's very well reasoned because I think she knew there was going to be a lot of scrutiny on her. So it's very it's very well laid out for how much time she had to write it. Essentially, she says she didn't find the federal government's argument credible that the Guard was necessary. The whole issue has been predicated on these protests that happened between June and September. And we saw, some protests really flare up in June. That was around when the National Guard was deployed to Los Angeles. It was also the first No Kings rally. That was when we saw a lot more conflict, confrontation, some violence at the ICE facility. But since that day in June, it's really been peaks and valleys of protests. There have been people there. There have been big groups, small groups, but it's been pretty much manageable.
A lot of inflatable frogs.
Yeah, a lot of inflatable frogs, especially recently. But essentially, she pointed out, it's really died down since June. We're talking about maybe 20 to 30 people at the building on a consistent basis. And Portland police testified and said, we have this under control. And I think she noted in her decision that she found Portland police's testimony credible. And, there are a few reasons that the Guard can be federalized. So part of the argument that she was answering was is the federal government unable to perform federal functions? Or is there a rebellion in Portland? And on both of those things, she said, no.
Mm-hmm. And I seem to recall that one of the federal government's arguments, which we'll get to in a second, was that they weren't able to essentially do their day-to-day work, right? But I remember that our colleagues reported about they actually were booking people in the facility over the summer when they said that they were not able to do their regular work. Is that right?
Yeah, there was like a 3-week closure, I believe, in July. And that did come up in court. And it sounds like, maybe there was some disruption, but they were able to move to another building. They were still doing the work. And as you pointed out, our colleagues have reported that, detentions maybe dipped a little bit, but really not significantly to suggest that they could not perform federal functions.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit more about that trial between the Trump administration and the local officials here. This, like you said, this trial centered around whether the president was legally justified in deploying troops here, right? Mm-hmm. Let's start with the federal government's arguments. Can you tell us a little bit about what they said?
Yeah, they pointed out that these demonstrations outside the building, that there have been, basically, they're not equipped to deal with them. They have Federal Protective Service officers, which are basically officers that are tasked with guarding federal property, federal facilities. And they pointed out that they'd had to send officers to the building to protect it over the summer. They said that the protesters there, were a credible threat. And they said that they couldn't rely on Portland police to back them up. They also, in cases like these, they make multiple arguments. They suggested that they seem to suggest that there was a rebellion happening, like that it met that qualification. And they really just focused on we need support, and support that we can't rely on the Federal Protective Service to do this. We need the Guard to come in and help protect these federal workers so that they can do their jobs.
Mm-hmm. And how did the state's lawyers respond to that?
They pointed out what I think ended up being a lot of what was in Immergit's decision, which was that local officials say, state, local, the Portland police have said this is under control. There are demonstrations. We respond to them. Portland police is really focused on taking a approach of de-escalation, trying to have these dialogue officers in to talk to protesters to, sort of make sure that things are under control or that they have a good sense of the crowd. They talked about how, there have been instances, but they were minor. They were mostly in June, and that it just didn't warrant the intervention, especially now, because, when the Guard was called in at the end of September, things had been really kind of petering out. There had been a couple days where you would see more people coming out to the building, but it wasn't on the scale of what it seemed like they were referencing. There wasn't the same volume of people, and it was pretty easily managed.
Mm-hmm. Michelle, help us understand what the judge's order, what it means. Does this effectively end this whole saga between Portland and the president, or what? What do you think?
Yeah. Well, we can't know for sure what exactly will happen, but this will likely be appealed. There are other cases around National Guard deployment happening. One in Chicago where the National Guard deployed, and then a federal judge also ruled that the deployment was not lawful. That has been appealed up to the Supreme Court, and there were briefs required on Monday that they filed, and there's some documents going back and forth, and we expect the Supreme Court to make a decision on that. So this is still very much in limbo to some extent. We don't know exactly how this is going to play out. Immergit's decision, that's a possibility that some of what she wrote could become supporting arguments for whatever decision the court makes, for whatever happens in the future, but we just don't know. And so we'll be watching the docket to see what happens.
Okay. Dirk and Michelle, thank you so much for your reporting. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Bryce.
Thank you.
This week's episode of OPB Politics Now was recorded live in the Gert Boyle studio. It was produced by Andrew Thien, and our audio engineer is Naleen Silva. Our music comes from Audio Network. We'll be back next week with more political news from across the Pacific Northwest. Until then, you can find all of OPB's reporting at opb.org. Thanks for your support, and thanks for listening.